There's the story of a king in ancient times. He conquered a new foreign land and took as one of his captives a beautiful maiden. She was so beautiful, he made her his queen. One day, the new queen received a message from her home country that many of the people there were being persecuted and some killed. A wise man who had advised her suggested that possibly she had been placed in the role of queen for just the chance to save her people. And so she decided that she must persuade the king to stop the persecution and killing of her people. The queen had to struggle with the question that you and I face every day when we need to persuade. The question is, by what means do we persuade? Do we use any and all means to persuade? Does the end justify the means? Or do we have a personal sense of ethics that will guide our choices in persuasion? This video focuses on the ethical considerations involved with persuasion. We have said that communication is the creation and sharing of meaning, and persuasion is the application of intent or motive to the communication process. Let's spend some time examining intent and motive. In other words, ethics. To do this, we'll examine the importance of ethics, suggest a definition of ethics, and explore different sources people have chosen for their source of ethics. Ethics are important. You might not have to save a nation of people. Maybe you're just using persuasion to convince your employer that you deserve a raise. Or you're trying to convince your spouse to take that cruise that you've been dreaming of. Whatever and whenever you persuade someone else of something, you should be thinking of the ethics of persuasion. Some might say that to have to stop and consider ethics in our daily use of persuasion is to suggest that we slow down our persuasive communication to a snail's pace while we overanalyze the entire process. I would propose that it is just as important to consider ethics in persuasion as it is to consider traffic laws when we drive. What happens if you're driving your car and you decide that thinking about all those crazy traffic laws is just unnecessary? You're just driving to the store and it's not too busy on the streets, so what can happen? Well, what can happen is chaos and accidents and people getting hurt, even though you had good intentions. When we persuade others without considering the ethics of persuasion, it may work out, or other people could get hurt in many ways. Let's stop and define what we mean when we use the word ethics. The textbook Persuasion in Your Lives by Sean Wall and Eric Morris says, ethics is a system of accepted principles that make up an individual's or group's values and judgment as to what's right and wrong. They go on to say that to understand ethics, you must first be able to distinguish or decide for yourself what is right or wrong, good or bad. And second, you must be able to make a conscious choice to act on that decision of morality. Life, someone said, must be lived on purpose. And this is essentially what ethics are. If you are ethical, you have purposefully considered what you consider right and wrong, and you have decided to try to live within that moral construct. Do people always consider the ethical choices involved when persuading? Do people understand and choose a set of ethics? The fact is that many people live an unexamined life. They have never asked themselves what is their source of their personal ethics. They have never considered the question of how do you decide if something is unethical or ethical, meaning morally right or wrong. I want to challenge you to think about this very thing with me for a few moments. Let's explore the 5 different sources of ethics. We'll identify these sources as perspectives. The first perspective people might have as a source of their ethics is a spiritual perspective. Some people call this a religious perspective, but using the word religion can carry many connotations. Today I'll call it a spiritual perspective to focus on the ethical consideration of a person's understanding of the nature of God, a higher power, or other spiritual understanding. Many people seek out a greater understanding of the nature of life, the meaning of life, and a truth outside of ourselves. In doing so, they seek a guide for decisions of what is right and wrong morally. When using the spiritual perspective, the ethical context focuses on a truth outside of ourselves. You would ask yourself, do my motives align with my spiritual morals? A second perspective people might have as a source for their ethics is the human nature perspective. This perspective would emphasize that there are unique characteristics that make us human or distinguish us from lower forms of life. Some of these characteristics would be our ability for rational thought, our ability to use words as symbols, and our ability to make value or moral judgments. When using the human nature perspective, the ethical context is asking if that persuasive appeal will elevate others or dehumanize and harm others. The third perspective people might have as a source for their ethics is the situational perspective. The focus of the situational perspective is that a moral judgment must be made within the context of the entirety of the situation. And how does that impact the people involved? This viewpoint sought to be a position between an absolute set of morals or truth and a view of no fixed morals at all. This does create, though, a slippery slope, where you can really justify any moral choice depending upon how you want to look at it. When using the situational perspective, the ethical choice can easily become a choice of expediency and a choice of placing your own needs above the needs of others. The fourth perspective people might have as a source for their ethics is the legal perspective. Society or government establishes legal perspectives on what is right or wrong, legal or illegal. This perspective often examines the action instead of the motive, and yet the motive for an action can determine the extent of punishment for an illegal action. It's important to know and consider the legal perspective of your ethical choices. While you may or may not have a strong spiritual or religious ethical perspective when making choices about how you're going to persuade others, it is wise to consider the legal perspective. When using the legal perspective, the ethical context is whether the laws of society say this action is legal or illegal. The fifth perspective people might have as a source for their ethics is the dialogical perspective. Communication and persuasion is never a monologue. It occurs in the context of a dialogue. This means that you are attempting to persuade someone else, another person or persons, in a conversation. The dialogical perspective contends that we should consider the other person or persons in that dialogical event. What are their needs? Or in what ways does my persuasive appeal bring a positive result or outcome to the other person, or negative? When using the dialogical perspective, the ethical context is asking if the persuasion is intended to only enrich you, or are you bringing an audience-centered solution when you're attempting to persuade the other person? So, what's the bottom line as we discuss ethical considerations involved in persuasion? The bottom line is taking responsibility for your ethics. Whether we have examined or identified the source of our ethics, we all do have ethics. We have some understanding of what's right and wrong, good or bad, and how we make those choices. That is, unless we're a true sociopath. You might emphasize a spiritual perspective, a human nature perspective, a legal perspective, or a dialogical perspective in your life. Or you might, as we all often do, combine these when making ethical choices. By the way, I would hope that you would do more than just hold a situational perspective, although this is a perspective many hold, of viewing ethics as a decision whether the end justifies the means in this situation, or in this context, would this be the best choice? As I said, take responsibility for your ethics. And when you're going to attempt to persuade someone, pause and take stock of the ethics behind your motives and your intent. There are many ways to persuade others, and in the upcoming videos, these will be examined. But we must first ask ourselves if we have our hearts in the right place. Have we examined and chosen our ethics? We may not have to persuade a king in order to save the lives of thousands of people. Or maybe you might. But just like the queen, you have to make a choice every day about the methods and the means you will use to persuade other people. See you in the next video.